Sometimes a father's love can move mountains, and sometimes it can expose corporate corruption. Daniel Reyes had been counting pennies for months, praying he could afford his daughter's college tuition. The 52-year-old mechanic walked into Pacific Tech Industries, hoping for a simple warehouse job. He wore his late wife's faded blue tie and carried 20 years of quiet dignity. A clerical mix-up sent him to the wrong floor. Suddenly, Daniel found himself face-to-face with CEO Victoria Sterling in her marble boardroom. She looked at this working-class man and decided to humiliate him. Sterling waved a confidential document written in Chinese characters. "If you're so smart," she sneered. "Read this." What she didn't know was that Daniel had spent years working overseas. He spoke fluent Mandarin from his days in international logistics before his wife's death. Daniel calmly began translating the document word by word. What he read would expose a $1 million fraud scheme and change both their lives forever. But would this humble father have the courage to take on one of the most powerful women in corporate America? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 8 years. Daniel Reyes reached across the narrow bed to silence it, his calloused fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long ago surrendered the luxury of sleeping in. The small apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of early morning traffic on Highway 101. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, allowing himself these precious seconds of stillness before the day demanded everything from him. At 52, his body carried the weight of decades spent beneath car hoods, his back aching with the persistent reminder of countless hours hunched over engines. His hands, permanently stained with traces of motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove, told the story of a man who worked with purpose but dreamed of something more. The photograph on his nightstand caught the morning light, filtering through the thin curtains. Maria smiled back at him, frozen in time at 38, her dark eyes sparkling with the same warmth that had first captured his heart 25 years ago in a small cafe in Shanghai. Next to her picture sat another frame, Sophia's high school graduation photo, her cap slightly askew, her grin so reminiscent of her mother's that it sometimes took Daniel's breath away. Sophia was 16 now, brilliant and determined, carrying within her the best of both her parents. She had her mother's gentle wisdom and her father's quiet strength, though she possessed an academic brilliance that humbled them both. While other teenagers spent their evenings on social media or video games, Sophia could be found at the kitchen table, textbooks spread around her like a fortress of knowledge, her pen moving steadily across pages of calculus problems or chemistry equations. The college acceptance letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, thick and promising in its official envelope from UC Berkeley. Daniel had watched Sophia's face transform as she read it, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she realized her dream of studying biochemistry was within reach. The full-ride scholarship she had hoped for, however, had not materialized. The partial aid would cover tuition, but room and board, books, and living expenses would still require nearly $20,000. Money that might as well have been $20 million for a mechanic, barely making ends meet. Daniel's current job at Martinez Auto Repair paid him fairly for his skills, but fair wages for a mechanic in this economy meant choosing between Sophia's future and basic necessities. He had already taken on weekend shifts at 2 other shops, his hands raw from the constant work, his body running on determination and strong coffee. Still, the numbers didn't add up. They never seemed to add up. The kitchen was small but clean, its linoleum floors worn smooth by years of quiet footsteps. Daniel moved through his morning routine with methodical precision, starting the coffee maker and pulling 2 pieces of bread from the bag for toast. The refrigerator held the basics: milk that would last another 2 days, eggs that Sophia would need for breakfast, and leftover casserole from their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had taken it upon herself to ensure the Reyes family didn't survive solely on takeout and determination. Sophia emerged from her bedroom at 6:15, her long dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her school backpack already loaded with the weight of advanced placement courses. She moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency she had learned from watching her father, pouring orange juice and checking her phone for any last-minute homework reminders. "Morning, Papa," she said, using the affectionate term that had stuck since childhood. Her voice carried the slight hoarseness of someone who had stayed up too late studying, though she would never admit to the sacrifice. "Morning, Mija," Daniel replied, sliding a plate of toast across the small table. "Chemistry test today." Sophia nodded, taking a sip of juice. "And calculus quiz. But I'm ready." She paused, studying her father's face with the perceptive eyes that missed nothing. "You look tired. Did you sleep at all?" Daniel had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, calculating and recalculating their finances, trying to find some mathematical miracle that would make Sophia's college dream possible without drowning them both in debt. The warehouse job at Pacific Tech Industries had seemed like an answer when he saw the posting better benefits, steady hours, and a small but meaningful increase in pay. It wasn't glamorous work, but it offered something his current situation couldn't: hope. "I slept enough," he said, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't the truth either. "What about you? You were up late again." Sophia shrugged with the casual defiance of a teenager who believed she could run on pure willpower. "I'm fine. Besides, this is important. Every grade matters now." The weight of her words settled between them like a familiar presence. Every grade did matter. Every test, every assignment, every extra credit opportunity was another step toward the future Sophia deserved. Daniel watched his daughter eat her toast with the focused determination of someone far older than her years, and he felt the familiar surge of pride mixed with protective worry that had defined his parenting since Maria's death. Maria had been the dreamer in their relationship, the one who spoke of possibilities and painted pictures of futures bright with promise. She had met Daniel during his years working in international logistics, when his job had taken him to Shanghai, and his fluency in Mandarin had made him invaluable to American companies expanding into Chinese markets. Those had been good years, filled with travel and adventure, and the intoxicating sense that the world was full of opportunities waiting to be seized. But dreams, Daniel had learned, were luxuries that couldn't always survive real life. When Maria was diagnosed with cancer, the medical bills had mounted faster than his international salary could cover. The experimental treatments, the hope-filled journeys to specialists, the desperate search for any option that might save her, all of it had drained their savings and forced Daniel to take a job closer to home, something stable and reliable that would keep him near the hospital. The international logistics career had ended not with fanfare, but with quiet resignation. Daniel had traded his passport for a mechanic's uniform, his multilingual business meetings for the honest work of fixing engines. It hadn't been a choice born of passion but of necessity, and he had made it without hesitation because Maria and Sophia needed him present, not traveling. Maria had fought the cancer with the same grace she brought to everything else, never complaining about the sacrifices, never expressing regret for the opportunities lost. Even as she grew weaker, she had continued to plan for Sophia's future, filling notebooks with college information and scholarship applications, determined that their daughter would have every advantage their love could provide. In her final weeks, Maria had made Daniel promise that he wouldn't let practical concerns limit Sophia's dreams. "She's brilliant, mi amor," Maria had whispered, her voice barely audible but her conviction absolute. "Don't let the world make her small because we don't have money. Promise me." Daniel had promised, though he hadn't fully understood then how difficult that promise would be to keep. Now, watching Sophia gather her books and prepare for another day of academic excellence, Daniel felt the familiar weight of that promise. The warehouse job at Pacific Tech Industries was just another step in honoring Maria's final wish. It wasn't glamorous, but it was progress. Every extra dollar would be another brick in the foundation of Sophia's future. Sophia stood to leave, slinging her backpack over one shoulder with practiced ease. She paused at the door, studying her father with the same careful attention she gave to her textbooks. "Papa," she said quietly, "you know I love you, right? And I know how hard you work for me." Daniel felt his throat tighten with the emotion he kept carefully controlled. "I know, mija, and I know your mama would be proud of you." Sophia smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like Maria, the same gentle eyes, the same quiet strength. "She'd be proud of you too." After Sophia left for school, Daniel sat alone in the kitchen, finishing his coffee and preparing mentally for the day ahead. The interview at Pacific Tech Industries wasn't until afternoon, which gave him time to complete a full day's work at the auto shop. He had requested the time off carefully, not wanting to seem unreliable, explaining only that he had an important appointment. The truth was, Daniel hadn't told anyone about the warehouse job application. It felt too much like admitting defeat, acknowledging that 20 years of mechanical expertise wasn't enough to provide for his daughter's future. His co-workers at Martinez Auto Repair respected him, valued his knowledge and his steady presence. But respect didn't pay for college tuition. Daniel finished his coffee and moved to the small closet where he kept his few good clothes. The blue tie hung there, carefully preserved and rarely worn. Maria had given it to him during their second year of marriage, a birthday gift that had cost her a week's worth of lunch money. The silk was faded now, the pattern slightly worn, but it remained his most treasured accessory. When he wore it, he carried Maria with him, her love and her faith in him woven into every thread. Today felt like a day for the blue tie. Today felt like a day when he needed Maria's strength to supplement his own. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of work. Daniel arrived at Martinez Auto Repair at 7:30, exchanging quiet greetings with his co-workers before settling into the day's first challenge, a transmission that had been giving everyone trouble for 3 days. He worked methodically, his hands moving with the confidence that came from decades of experience, his mind focused on the intricate puzzle of gears and fluid lines. By noon, he had solved the transmission problem and completed 2 oil changes. His supervisor, Carlos Martinez, approached with the kind of expression that suggested he had something important to say. "Daniel," Carlos began, his tone careful, "I know you requested time off this afternoon. Everything okay?" Daniel continued cleaning his hands with the industrial soap, considering his response. Carlos had been good to him over the years, fair and understanding about the occasional emergency with Sophia or the rare sick day. He deserved honesty, or at least as much honesty as Daniel was prepared to offer. "Just an appointment," Daniel said. "Nothing serious." Carlos nodded, though his expression suggested he suspected there was more to the story. "You know, if you ever need to talk about anything, money troubles, family stuff, I've been where you are. Single parent, trying to make ends meet. It's not easy." The offer was genuine, and Daniel appreciated it more than he could express. But accepting help, admitting need, felt like another form of defeat. He had been independent for so long, self-reliant by necessity and pride, that the idea of leaning on others seemed foreign. "I'm managing," Daniel said, which was technically true, even if it didn't capture the full complexity of his situation. Carlos studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Well, the offer stands. And Daniel, whatever this appointment is about, I hope it goes well." At 2 o'clock, Daniel left the auto shop and drove home to prepare for the interview. He showered carefully, washing away the day's accumulation of grease and sweat, and dressed in his best clothes, dark slacks that had seen better years, a white shirt that Sophia had helped him iron, and the blue silk tie that carried Maria's love with it. Standing before the bathroom mirror, Daniel barely recognized the man looking back at him. Clean-shaven and formally dressed, he looked more like the international logistics professional he had once been than the mechanic he had become. The transformation was subtle but significant, a reminder of the man he had been before life had redirected his path. The drive to Pacific Tech Industries took 35 minutes through afternoon traffic. Daniel used the time to review what he knew about the company, a mid-sized technology firm specializing in international software development, with offices in 12 countries and a reputation for innovation. The warehouse position would involve basic inventory management and shipping coordination, nothing that required his dormant language skills or his abandoned business experience. It was honest work that would pay the bills and move them incrementally closer to Sophia's college dreams. Pacific Tech Industries occupied a gleaming glass building in the heart of the business district, its modern architecture speaking of success and ambition. Daniel parked his aging Honda Civic among the luxury cars in the visitor section, feeling like an imposter in this world of corporate achievement. The lobby was all marble and chrome, designed to impress visitors and employees alike. Daniel approached the reception desk, where a young woman with a professional smile verified his appointment and directed him to the Human Resources office on the 3rd floor. The elevator ride felt like a journey between worlds, carrying him from the ground floor of his current reality to the elevated spaces where decisions about his future would be made. When the doors opened, Daniel stepped into a corridor lined with motivational posters and corporate awards, the physical manifestation of a success he had once pursued but never quite achieved. What Daniel didn't know, as he walked toward what he believed would be a simple warehouse job interview, was that a clerical error had already set in motion events that would change everything. The temporary receptionist, overwhelmed by her first week on the job, had misread his appointment slip. Instead of directing him to Human Resources on the 3rd floor, she should have sent him to the warehouse office in the basement. Instead, Daniel Reyes, mechanic, widower, devoted father, was about to walk into the executive boardroom on the 15th floor, where CEO Victoria Sterling was conducting a high-stakes meeting that would determine the future of hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in corporate assets. The blue silk tie, Maria's gift of love and faith, would prove to be exactly the talisman he needed for what lay ahead. The elevator stopped at the 15th floor with a soft chime that seemed to echo in the marble-lined corridor beyond. Daniel stepped out, checking the slip of paper in his hand one more time. The temporary receptionist had seemed frazzled, but her directions had been clear enough. 15th floor, turn right, 3rd door down. He had assumed she meant the Human Resources Department had been relocated for some administrative reason. The hallway stretched before him like a gallery of corporate success, polished floors that reflected the recessed lighting above, walls lined with framed awards and photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and glass-enclosed conference rooms where serious-looking people in expensive suits conducted the business of international commerce. Daniel felt increasingly out of place with each step, his worn shoes silent against the pristine floor. The 3rd door bore no nameplate, just a frosted glass panel that revealed the shadowy outlines of people gathered around what appeared to be a large table. Daniel knocked twice, waited for a response that didn't come, and then opened the door as he had been instructed to do. The boardroom that greeted him was unlike anything he had ever seen in person. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Daniel made in a month. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while abstract artwork adorned the walls between built-in displays, showcasing the company's global reach. Everything in the room spoke of power, influence, and money. Lots of money. 7 people sat around the table, all turning to look at Daniel, with expressions ranging from surprise to barely concealed annoyance. At the head of the table sat a woman in her early 40s, her silver hair styled in a precise bob that framed sharp features and calculating grey eyes. She wore a navy blue suit that looked like it had been tailored specifically for her frame, and her posture suggested someone accustomed to command. This was Victoria Sterling, CEO of Pacific Tech Industries, though Daniel had no way of knowing that yet. What he did know, with the uncomfortable certainty that comes from walking into the wrong place at the wrong time, was that he had made a serious mistake. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his hand still on the door handle, preparing to retreat. "I think I'm in the wrong place. I was looking for Mr. Reyes?" Victoria Sterling's voice cut through his apology with the precision of a scalpel. She glanced down at a tablet in front of her, then back up at Daniel, with an expression that suggested she was recalculating something. "Daniel Reyes?" "Yes, ma'am, but I think there's been some confusion. I'm here for a warehouse position interview." A ripple of barely suppressed amusement passed around the table. One of the men, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car, actually smirked. Another woman, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, raised an eyebrow as if Daniel's presence was somehow personally offensive. Victoria Sterling studied Daniel for a long moment, her grey eyes taking in his carefully pressed shirt, his faded blue tie, and his calloused hands. Something shifted in her expression, not kindness, exactly, but a kind of calculating interest that Daniel couldn't interpret. "Please, sit down, Mr. Reyes," she said, gesturing to an empty chair halfway down the table. "There's been a miscommunication, clearly, but as long as you're here, perhaps you can help us with something." Daniel remained standing, every instinct telling him to apologize again and leave. "Ma'am, I really think I should go find the right." "Sit down." The command in Victoria's voice was unmistakable, and Daniel found himself complying before he had consciously decided to do so. The leather chair was more comfortable than anything in his apartment, but he perched on its edge, ready to flee at the first appropriate opportunity. Victoria reached into a folder beside her tablet and withdrew a document, several pages of dense text that appeared to be some kind of official report or contract. Even from where he sat, Daniel could see that it wasn't in English. The characters were complex, angular, immediately recognizable to him, though he hadn't seen them in a professional context for years. Chinese. Simplified Chinese, to be specific, the kind used in mainland business documents. "Mr. Reyes," Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone that Daniel would later recognize as her particular brand of corporate cruelty. "Since you're here, and since our regular translator seems to be unavailable today, perhaps you could help us understand this document." She slid the papers across the polished table toward Daniel. The characters seemed to jump off the page at him, familiar phrases, technical terminology, the formal language of international business contracts that he had once navigated as easily as reading a newspaper. "I don't understand," Daniel said, though his eyes were already scanning the document's header, automatically beginning to translate the title in his head. "It's quite simple," Victoria continued, and now there was definitely cruelty in her voice, a sharp-edged amusement that made Daniel's stomach tighten. "This document came to us from one of our Chinese partners. It's rather important to our company's future, and we need to understand exactly what it says. Since you're here, and since you seem to be a man who works with his hands," she paused, letting her gaze linger on Daniel's stained fingers. "Perhaps you have some hidden talents we don't know about." The other executives around the table were watching now, with the focused attention of people witnessing something entertaining. Daniel realized, with a growing sense of humiliation, that he was being used as some kind of corporate amusement, a working-class man brought in to demonstrate his limitations for the entertainment of people who had never doubted their own superiority. "Ma'am, I'm just here about a warehouse job," Daniel said quietly, pushing the document back toward the center of the table. "I think there's been a mistake." Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, there's been a mistake, certainly, but as long as you're here, humor me. After all, if you're going to work for Pacific Tech Industries, even in our warehouse, don't you think you should understand what kind of company we are, what kind of international business we conduct?" She pushed the document back toward Daniel, more forcefully this time. "So please, Mr. Reyes, if you're so smart, if you have so much to offer our company, read this." The challenge hung in the air like a weapon. Daniel could feel the weight of 7 sets of eyes on him, could sense the collective expectation that he would fumble through a few words of broken English translation before admitting defeat. This was Victoria Sterling's idea of fun, watching a working man discover his place in the corporate hierarchy. But Victoria Sterling had made a critical miscalculation. Daniel looked down at the document again, and this time he didn't fight the recognition that flooded through him. The characters were indeed familiar, not from casual exposure or tourist-level study, but from years of professional immersion. The header read, "Confidential Financial Transfer Agreement, Pacific Tech Industries, Shanghai Division," and the content that followed made Daniel's blood run cold. This wasn't just a business contract. This was evidence. Evidence of systematic financial manipulation, fraudulent reporting to American regulatory agencies, and the systematic theft of employee pension funds. The document detailed how Pacific Tech's Chinese operations had been artificially inflating revenue reports while secretly diverting money meant for American employees into private accounts controlled by select executives. Daniel's mind raced as he processed the implications. The warehouse workers he had hoped to join, the honest employees who trusted their company to safeguard their retirement funds, all of them were being robbed by the very people sitting around this table. He looked up at Victoria Sterling, who was still wearing her cruel smile, still expecting him to crumble under the weight of his own inadequacy. The other executives continued to watch with varying degrees of amusement and impatience, clearly ready for this bit of entertainment to conclude so they could return to more important matters. Daniel made a choice that would change everything. "This document," he said quietly, his voice carrying the careful precision of a man who had once negotiated million-dollar contracts in 3 languages, details a systematic embezzlement scheme involving the transfer of employee pension funds to private accounts in the Cayman Islands. The silence that followed was so complete that Daniel could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Victoria Sterling's smile disappeared, as if it had been surgically removed. The executive who had smirked earlier was now staring at Daniel with an expression of pure shock. Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "According to this agreement, dated 6 months ago, Pacific Tech's Shanghai Division has been reporting inflated revenues to American regulators while secretly diverting $2.3 million in employee retirement funds. The money has been distributed among shell companies controlled by," he paused to read specific names, "3 executives listed here as primary beneficiaries." He looked directly at Victoria Sterling, who had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. The document also indicates that federal investigators have begun preliminary inquiries into discrepancies in Pacific Tech's financial reporting, which explains why this agreement includes provisions for emergency fund transfers and document destruction. Daniel set the papers down on the table with the same care he might use to defuse a bomb. "Ma'am, I believe you asked me to read this document. I've read it, and unless I'm seriously misunderstanding something, your company is in very serious trouble." The boardroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Victoria Sterling stared at Daniel as if he had just performed magic, her grey eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and something that might have been respect. The other executives looked like they had been caught in headlights, frozen between the impulse to deny everything and the growing realization that their carefully constructed house of cards was tumbling down around them. Finally, Victoria found her voice. "Who are you?" she whispered, and for the first time since Daniel had entered the room, she sounded genuinely human rather than coldly corporate. Daniel straightened in his chair, feeling Maria's blue silk tie against his collar like a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. "I'm Daniel Reyes, ma'am. I'm a mechanic, and I'm here because I need a job that will help me pay for my daughter's college education. But before I became a mechanic, I spent 15 years in international logistics, specializing in Chinese business relationships and financial compliance." He paused, letting that information sink in before continuing. "And right now, ma'am, I think you and I need to have a very serious conversation about what's really going on at Pacific Tech Industries. The confidential document lay between them on the mahogany table, no longer just a test of Daniel's limitations, but evidence of a conspiracy that would either destroy the company or transform it entirely. The choice of which direction it would go was about to fall into the most unlikely hands imaginable, those of a widowed mechanic who wore his dead wife's tie and fought every day to build a better future for his daughter. Victoria Sterling was beginning to realize that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career, and Daniel Reyes was beginning to understand that his fight for Sophia's future was about to become something much larger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The silence in the boardroom stretched until it became almost unbearable. Victoria Sterling's face had shifted through several expressions: surprise, calculation, fear, and now something approaching cautious respect. The other executives around the table looked like they were collectively holding their breath, waiting for someone to tell them how to respond to this impossible situation. Daniel remained seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap, though his heart was racing. He had just exposed what appeared to be a massive corporate fraud, and he had no idea what the consequences might be. These people had power, money, and influence, everything he lacked. But they also had something to hide, which gave him an advantage he was only beginning to understand. "Mr. Reyes," Victoria said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "I think we need to discuss this privately. Everyone else, please leave us alone." The other executives began to rise from their chairs, but the man who had smirked earlier, a thin, pale figure with nervous eyes, remained seated. "Victoria, I don't think that's wise. We don't know who this man is, what his motives might be." "Richard," Victoria's voice cut through his protest like ice. "I said everyone else. That includes you." Richard's face flushed red, but he gathered his papers and left with the others. Daniel watched them file out, noting the worried glances they exchanged, the way they seemed to be calculating their own exposure to whatever storm was coming. When the door closed behind the last executive, Victoria turned her full attention to Daniel. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 42 or 43, with premature silver in her hair that spoke of stress and long hours. Her grey eyes were intelligent and sharp, but there was something else there now, a vulnerability that her corporate armor couldn't quite conceal. "Before we continue," she said, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you wearing a wire? Are you working with federal investigators?" Daniel almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "Ma'am, I'm a mechanic from East San Jose. I drive a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and I'm here because I need a warehouse job that pays $3 more per hour than I'm making now. I don't even own a suit that fits properly." Victoria studied his face for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal conclusion. "Tell me about your background, the real story, not just the mechanic part." Daniel considered how much to reveal. His instinct was to keep his personal history private, but the document on the table between them had changed everything. If he was going to navigate this situation safely, he needed Victoria to understand exactly who she was dealing with. "I started in logistics right out of college," he began. "Got hired by a company called Global Trade Solutions. They specialized in helping American manufacturers establish supply chains in Asia. I had studied Mandarin in college, more as a personal interest than anything else, but it turned out to be exactly what the company needed." He paused, remembering those early days when the world had seemed full of possibilities. "I spent 3 years learning the business from the bottom up, then got promoted to senior coordinator for Chinese operations. That meant I was living in Shanghai about 6 months out of every year, managing contracts, negotiating agreements, making sure American companies didn't get taken advantage of by suppliers who assumed we couldn't read the fine print." Victoria nodded, her expression indicating she understood the complexities of international business. "How long did you do that work?" 15 years total. I got good at it, really good. By the end, I was handling contracts worth tens of millions of dollars, managing relationships with dozens of Chinese manufacturers, and I could spot financial irregularities or fraudulent documentation from across a conference room." Daniel gestured toward the document on the table. Documents like this one were part of my daily routine. What happened? Why did you stop? Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of Maria's illness. My wife got sick. Cancer. The treatments were experimental, expensive, and they required me to be present rather than traveling. I took a position with a smaller company here in California, but when the medical bills started mounting, I had to find work that paid immediately and consistently. Mechanics always have work. Victoria's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Daniel straightened in his chair, returning to the matter at hand. Now, ma'am, I think you need to tell me what's really going on here. Because that document isn't something that accidentally ended up on your desk. Someone gave it to you for a reason. Victoria stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city, as if the answer to her problems might be visible in the urban landscape below. When she turned back to Daniel, her corporate mask had slipped completely. 6 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in our financial reports, she said. Small things at first, discrepancies between what our Shanghai division was reporting and what our internal audits were showing. Revenue numbers that seemed too good to be true, expense reports that didn't quite add up. She returned to her seat, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden alone. I ordered a comprehensive review of our international operations, but every time my internal auditors got close to something significant, they would hit roadblocks. Documents would disappear, computer files would become corrupted, key personnel would suddenly become unavailable. Daniel nodded, recognizing the pattern. Someone was covering their tracks. Exactly, so I hired an external investigator, a forensic accountant who specialized in international corporate fraud. She worked for 3 months, following the money trail, and what she found was worse than I had imagined. Victoria opened a locked drawer in the table and withdrew a thick file folder. 3 of my senior executives have been systematically embezzling money from employee pension funds, using our Chinese operations as a cover. They created shell companies, falsified revenue reports, and diverted millions of dollars into personal accounts. She slid the folder toward Daniel. That document you just translated, it was sent to me anonymously last week by someone inside our Shanghai office. Someone who apparently wanted me to know exactly how deep this conspiracy goes. Daniel opened the folder and found himself looking at bank records, email transcripts, and financial documents that painted a clear picture of corporate theft on a massive scale. The scope was breathtaking, not just the $2.3 million mentioned in the Chinese document, but a systematic looting of company assets that had been going on for over 2 years. How much are we talking about in total? Daniel asked. Nearly $7 million. Money that should be in retirement accounts for our warehouse workers, our customer service representatives, our maintenance staff. Victoria's voice hardened with anger. People who trust this company to take care of them after they've given us their working lives. Daniel thought about the warehouse job he had come here to apply for, about the workers who were being robbed by the very executives who managed their benefits. These weren't abstract victims, these were people like him, working hard to support their families and build modest futures. Why are you telling me this? He asked. You don't know me. For all you know, I could be working with the people who are stealing from you. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mr. Reyes, do you know how many people I've shown this evidence to? How many lawyers, consultants, and investigators I've hired to help me figure out what to do? Daniel shook his head. Exactly 2. Everyone else I've approached has either been too afraid to get involved or has tried to convince me to handle this quietly, meaning sweep it under the rug and hope it goes away. She gestured toward the Chinese. Document. You're the first person who looked at that evidence and immediately understood not just what it said, but what it meant for the people being hurt. Daniel studied Victoria's face, trying to read the motivations behind her words. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking for your help. Victoria said simply. I need someone who understands international financial documentation, someone who can't be bought or intimidated by my own executives, and someone who has a personal stake in seeing justice done for working people. She paused, looking directly into Daniel's eyes. I'm asking you to help me expose this fraud and recover the stolen money before these thieves can destroy any more evidence or steal any more from people who can't afford to lose it. Daniel felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He had come here looking for a simple warehouse job, a modest increase in income that might help him afford Sophia's college expenses. Instead, he was being asked to take on powerful executives in a corporate conspiracy that could easily destroy him if he chose the wrong side. But he thought about the workers whose pension money had been stolen, about families like his own who depended on those benefits for their security and dignity. He thought about Sophia, who deserved to grow up in a world where people were held accountable for their actions, where hard work and honesty were rewarded rather than exploited. Most of all, he thought about Maria and the promise he had made to her that he would never let practical concerns prevent him from doing what was right. If I help you, Daniel said slowly, what exactly would that involve? Victoria leaned forward, and for the first time since he had entered the boardroom, Daniel saw hope in her grey eyes. It would involve using your expertise to help me understand the full scope of the fraud, to document the evidence in a way that prosecutors can use, and to help me figure out how to recover the stolen money before it disappears permanently. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small photograph, Sophia's graduation picture, which he carried with him always. He set it on the mahogany table next to the Chinese document and the evidence of corporate theft. That's my daughter, he said quietly. She's 16, brilliant, and she's been accepted to UC Berkeley to study biochemistry. Everything I do for her future. Victoria looked at the photograph, then back at Daniel. She's beautiful. She looks like she has your determination. She has her mother's wisdom and her father's stubbornness. Daniel replied, and if I'm going to help you, it's because I want her to live in a world where people like us, working people, don't get cheated by people with power. Daniel picked up the photograph and returned it to his pocket, then extended his hand across the table. I'll help you, Ms. Sterling, but I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this for Pacific Tech Industries or for your executives. I'm doing this for the warehouse workers and the maintenance staff and everyone else who's been robbed. Victoria shook his hand, her grip firm and warm. I understand completely, Mr. Reyes, and I think this might be the beginning of something that could change everything. As they sat in the marble boardroom, surrounded by the symbols of corporate power, neither Daniel nor Victoria could have predicted how dangerous their alliance would become, or how many powerful people would try to stop them from seeking justice for the workers whose trust had been betrayed. The arrangement Victoria proposed was unlike anything Daniel had ever imagined. Rather than the warehouse position he had applied for, she offered him a consulting contract that would pay 3 times his mechanic's salary, enough to cover Sophia's college expenses, and then some. The work would be conducted discreetly, with Daniel maintaining his current job as cover, while spending evenings and weekends helping Victoria build a case against the corrupt executives. But as Daniel drove home from Pacific Tech Industries that evening, his mind wasn't focused on the financial opportunity. Instead, he kept thinking about the faces of the workers he hadn't met yet, the people whose retirement funds had been stolen while they continued showing up every day, trusting their employer to protect their futures. The small apartment felt different when he arrived home. The same modest furniture, the same worn carpet, the same photographs on the walls, but everything was touched by the possibility of change. Sophia was at the kitchen table as usual, textbooks spread around her like an academic fortress, her pen moving steadily across calculus problems. How did the interview go, Papa? She asked without looking up from her work. Daniel hung his jacket on the back of a chair and loosened the blue silk tie, considering how much to share. Sophia was mature beyond her years, but the complexity of what he had stumbled into seemed too heavy for anyone's shoulders, let alone those of a 16-year-old. "It went differently than I expected," he said finally. "More complicated, but potentially better." Sophia looked up then, her dark eyes, so like her mother's, studying his face with the perceptive attention that missed nothing. "You look like you've seen a ghost, or like you're about to make a decision that scares you." Daniel sat across from her, marveling as he always did at her insight. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the scary thing to do. "Is this about money? About college?" Sophia's voice carried the careful neutrality she had learned to use when discussing their financial situation, but Daniel could hear the underlying worry. "Partially, but it's also about something bigger than that." Daniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. "Misha, what would you say if I told you I had a chance to help people who were being cheated, people like us, but that helping them might involve some risk?" Sophia closed her calculus textbook and gave him her full attention. "I'd say that sounds like something Mama would have wanted you to do." The simple truth of her words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Maria had always believed in fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, had always chosen principle over convenience. During her final weeks, she had made Daniel promise not just to provide for Sophia's future, but to raise her to understand that privilege came with responsibility. "There's something I need to show you," Daniel said, standing to retrieve a small wooden box from their bedroom closet. He had kept Maria's personal papers there, along with the few mementos he couldn't bear to part with. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was an envelope he had never opened. Sophia watched with growing curiosity as Daniel returned to the table and carefully extracted the envelope. Her name was written on the front in Maria's familiar handwriting, along with instructions for Sophia when she needs to understand who her father really is. "Mama left this for you," Daniel said quietly. "I was supposed to give it to you when you were older, when you were making important decisions about your future. I think maybe tonight is the right time." Sophia took the envelope with the reverence due to a message from beyond, her fingers tracing the letters of her name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered with Maria's careful handwriting. Sophia read silently for several minutes, and Daniel watched emotions play across her face: surprise, recognition, pride, and finally, a deep understanding. "She says you gave up everything for us," Sophia whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Your career, your dreams, your whole life in international business. She says you never complained, never made us feel like we were holding you back." Daniel felt his own throat tighten. He had never told Sophia about the career he had abandoned, had never wanted her to feel responsible for the choices he had made. Sophia looked up from the letter, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something that looked like fierce pride. "She also says that someday you might get a chance to use those skills again, to help people the way you always wanted to. And when that day comes, she wants you to know that she and I both believe you should take it, no matter how scary it might seem." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of Maria's wisdom, delivered from beyond death, through words written in anticipation of exactly this moment. Daniel realized that his wife had understood him better than he understood himself, had known that his sense of justice and his skills would eventually find a way to resurface. "There are people at this company, Pacific Tech Industries, who have been stealing money from workers' retirement funds," Daniel said finally. "The CEO wants my help to expose them and get the money back. It's complicated, and it could be dangerous. But it's the right thing to do," Sophia finished. "And Mama knew you would choose to do the right thing." Daniel nodded, feeling as if Maria herself had just given him permission to step back into the world he had left behind for her sake. "It would mean better pay for us, enough to cover your college expenses without debt. But more importantly, it would mean helping families like ours who depend on their employers to keep promises about their futures." Sophia carefully folded Maria's letter and held it against her chest. "Papa, do you remember what you taught me about being afraid? That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. Then I think you know what you have to do." The next morning, Daniel called Victoria Sterling's private number, which she had given him, along with strict instructions about when and how to use it. Her assistant put him through immediately, and Victoria's voice carried a note of barely contained anxiety. "Mr. Reyes, I was hoping you would call. Have you made a decision?" "I'll help you," Daniel said simply. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "First, I continue working my regular job until this is resolved. I don't want to give anyone reason to think I'm anything other than what I appear to be. Second, you don't pay me anything until we've recovered money for the workers who were robbed. And third, if this gets dangerous, if these people try to hurt me or my daughter, I walk away, and you don't try to stop me." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Those are reasonable conditions, Mr. Reyes. More than reasonable. When can you start?" "Tonight, if you need me to, but we meet somewhere other than your office. Too many people saw me there yesterday." Victoria suggested a small cafe in downtown San Jose, a place where two people could have a quiet conversation without drawing attention. Daniel agreed to meet her at 7 o'clock, after Sophia had finished her homework and settled in for the evening. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze of normalcy, punctuated by moments of surreal anticipation. Daniel went to work at Martinez Auto Repair, completed his usual tasks, and exchanged the same routine conversations with his co-workers. But underneath the familiar rhythm of oil changes and brake repairs, his mind was processing the complexity of what he had agreed to undertake. Carlos Martinez noticed the change immediately. "You seem different today," he observed as Daniel cleaned his hands at the end of his shift. "More focused, but also more distant. Everything okay at home?" "Everything's fine," Daniel replied, which was both true and completely inadequate. "Just thinking about some changes that might be coming." Carlos nodded knowingly. "Changes can be good, especially when you've been stuck in the same place for a while. Just remember, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps." The cafe Victoria had chosen was exactly the kind of place Daniel would have picked himself: quiet, unpretentious, with corner booths that afforded privacy for serious conversations. Victoria was already waiting when he arrived, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater rather than her corporate uniform. Without the armor of her business attire, she looked more approachable, more human. "Thank you for coming," she said as Daniel slid into the booth across from her. "And thank you for agreeing to help. I know this isn't what you expected when you applied for a warehouse job." Daniel ordered coffee and studied Victoria's face in the soft light of the cafe. "Tell me about the people we're trying to help. Not the numbers or the financial details. Tell me about the actual people." Victoria's expression shifted, becoming more personal. "There's a woman named Elena Vasquez who's worked in our customer service department for 12 years. She's 58 years old, and she was planning to retire in 7 years with the pension she's been paying into since she started. Except now that pension is worth about 60% of what it should be." She paused, her voice becoming quieter. "There's a man named Robert Chen, no relation to our former translator, who works in our warehouse. He's been with the company for 15 years, has 2 kids in high school, and he has diabetes that requires expensive medication. His retirement account was supposed to cover his medical expenses after he stops working." Daniel felt his anger building as Victoria continued describing the victims of the fraud, real people with real families and real needs, all of them trusting their employer to honor the promises made when they were hired. "The worst part," Victoria continued, "is that these people have no idea what's been done to them. They continue showing up every day, working hard, believing that their loyalty and dedication are being rewarded with security for their futures." "How do we tell them?" Daniel asked. "How do we explain that the company they've trusted has betrayed them?" "We don't tell them anything until we can also tell them that we're fixing it," Victoria replied firmly. "These people can't afford to lose faith in their futures, not until we can offer them something better than despair." Daniel nodded, understanding the wisdom in her approach. "What's our next step?" Victoria reached into her purse and withdrew a small notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. I've been documenting everything I've discovered so far, but I need someone with your expertise to help me understand the full scope of what's been stolen and how to trace it. She slid the notebook across the table to Daniel. This contains account numbers, transaction records, and correspondence between our executives and their accomplices in China. But it's incomplete, and some of it is beyond my ability to interpret. Daniel opened the notebook and found himself looking at Victoria's meticulous documentation of corporate theft. Her handwriting was precise, her organization systematic, and her attention to detail impressive. But as he scanned the entries, Daniel began to see patterns and connections that Victoria had missed evidence of additional theft that went beyond what she had already discovered. "Victoria," Daniel said quietly, looking up from the notebook, "I think the problem is bigger than you realize." The photographs of Sophia changed everything. What had begun as an investigation into corporate fraud had become a personal war between Daniel and people who were willing to threaten a 16-year-old girl to protect their stolen wealth. That night, as Sophia slept peacefully in her bedroom, unaware of the danger that surrounded her, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, making plans that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. By morning, Daniel had reached a decision that surprised even him. Instead of backing down or seeking protection, he was going to accelerate the investigation and force a confrontation with the corrupt executives before they could make good on their threats. But first, he needed to ensure Sophia's safety without alarming her about the danger she faced. "Misha," Daniel said over breakfast, trying to keep his voice casual, "how would you feel about spending a few weeks with your Tia Carmen in Los Angeles?" Sophia looked up from her textbook, immediately suspicious. Her Aunt Carmen was Maria's sister, a warm and loving woman who had offered countless times to help with Sophia's care, but Daniel had always politely declined, preferring to maintain their independence. "Why now?" Sophia asked. "Is something wrong? Are you sick?" Daniel had anticipated the question and prepared a partial truth. "I'm going to be working some evening shifts for the next few weeks, and I don't want you alone in the apartment so much. Carmen would love to have you, and you could use her help with your college applications." Sophia studied his face with the perceptive attention that made lying to her nearly impossible. "Papa, you're scared about something. I can see it in your eyes." Daniel reached across the table and took her hands in his. "I'm working on something important, something that could help a lot of people. But yes, it involves some risk, and I need to know you're safe while I handle it." Sophia's expression shifted from suspicion to understanding. "This is about what Mama wrote in her letter, isn't it? About you getting a chance to help people again." Daniel nodded, marveling as always at his daughter's insight. "Exactly. But helping people sometimes means making enemies of the people who were hurting them." Sophia was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Then she surprised Daniel by reaching into her backpack and pulling out Maria's letter, which she had been carrying with her since the night he gave it to her. "Mama knew this would happen," Sophia said quietly, pointing to a paragraph Daniel hadn't noticed during their first reading. "She wrote that when you decided to fight for what was right, other people might try to stop you by threatening the people you loved." Daniel felt his throat tighten as he read Maria's words. "If someone ever tries to use Sophia or me as weapons against your conscience, remember that we are strongest when we stand together, even if distance separates us temporarily." "She wanted me to go to Carmen's if this happened," Sophia continued. "She wanted you to know that I would understand and support you, even if it meant being apart for a while." Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes, tears of grief for Maria's absence, pride in Sophia's maturity, and gratitude for his wife's ability to guide them even from beyond death. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" Sophia stood and came around the table to hug him, her embrace carrying all the love and strength Maria had instilled in both of them. "I'm proud of you, Papa, for fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. Mama would be proud too." 3 hours later, Daniel was driving Sophia to Los Angeles. Her suitcase packed with clothes and textbooks, her acceptance of the situation both heartening and heartbreaking. Carmen welcomed her niece with the kind of overwhelming affection that reminded Daniel why Maria had loved her sister so deeply. "You take care of whatever needs taking care of," Carmen told Daniel as they stood on her front porch. "Sophia will be safe here, and she'll have everything she needs for school." The drive back to San Jose gave Daniel time to think about his next steps. With Sophia safely out of reach, he could focus completely on the investigation without worrying about her safety. But more importantly, the executive's decision to threaten his daughter had revealed something crucial about their state of mind. They were desperate enough to resort to intimidation, which meant they felt cornered. Desperate people made mistakes, and Daniel intended to encourage as many mistakes as possible. He called Victoria from the road, using the secure phone she had provided for their communications. "We need to meet tonight," he said without preamble. "Something has happened that changes everything." They met at a different cafe, in a different part of the city, taking precautions that had become second nature over the past weeks. Victoria took one look at Daniel's face and immediately understood that their situation had escalated. "They threatened Sophia," Daniel said without any attempt to soften the news. "Photographs of her at school, at the places she goes after school. A very clear message that they know how to hurt me if I don't stop investigating." Victoria's face went white. "Oh my God, Daniel, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I never should have involved you in this." "Victoria, listen to me," Daniel interrupted. "This isn't your fault, and I'm not walking away, but the rules of engagement just changed. These people declared war on my family, which means I'm going to destroy them completely." Daniel pulled out a folder he had been preparing during the drive home from Los Angeles. "I've been thinking about our approach, and I realize we've been too cautious. We've been gathering evidence to present to prosecutors, but prosecutors take time, and these people might use that time to disappear." He opened the folder and spread its contents across the table: financial records, personnel files, and communication logs that painted a detailed picture of the conspiracy. "Instead of building a case for the courts, I want to build a case for the court of public opinion. I want to destroy these people's reputations, their business relationships, and their ability to hide behind corporate respectability." Victoria studied the documents Daniel had prepared. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we expose everything at once: the theft, the cover-up, the threats against witnesses. I want to contact investigative journalists, regulatory agencies, and employee advocacy groups simultaneously. Create such a firestorm of publicity that these executives can't control the narrative or buy their way out of consequences." Daniel paused, making sure Victoria understood the implications. "But if we do this, there's no going back. Your company will face intense scrutiny, regulatory investigation, and probably significant financial penalties. Some of your employees might lose their jobs in the short term." Victoria was quiet for several minutes, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Finally, she looked up at Daniel with the kind of determination that had built her career and earned his respect. "What do we need to do?" Over the next hour, they planned a coordinated assault on the conspiracy that would make Thompson's threats look like playground bullying. Daniel would use his knowledge of international business to document the precise mechanisms of the theft, while Victoria would provide access to internal company communications that proved executive knowledge and participation. "There's something else," Daniel said as they prepared to leave the cafe. "I want to talk to some of the workers whose money was stolen. Not to alarm them, but to document the human cost of what these executives did." Victoria nodded. "I can arrange that. But Daniel, are you prepared for how angry they're going to be? These people trusted Pacific Tech with their futures." Daniel thought about Elena Vasquez, the customer service representative whose retirement had been stolen, and Robert Chen, the warehouse worker whose medical expenses would no longer be covered by his pension. These weren't abstract victims. They were people whose lives had been damaged by corporate greed. "I'm counting on their anger," Daniel replied. "Angry people don't stay quiet, and quiet is what these executives need to survive." The next morning, Daniel began the most intensive investigation of his life. Using skills he hadn't exercised in years and resources Victoria provided, he traced the stolen money through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, shell companies, and fraudulent investment schemes. What he discovered was even more sophisticated and extensive than their worst fears. Richard Morrison, Pacific Tech's CFO, had used his position to create dozens of fake vendor contracts, paying millions of dollars to companies that existed only on paper. James Kim, head of international operations, had been inflating the costs of their Chinese manufacturing partnerships and pocketing the difference. And Thomas Bradley, the company's head of human resources, had been systematically reducing employee benefit contributions while reporting full payments to government regulators. Together, the three men had stolen over $18 million across 4 years, using Pacific Tech's legitimate business operations as cover for systematic theft. But more disturbing than the money was what Daniel discovered about their plans for the future, evidence that they were preparing to leave the country with their stolen wealth, abandoning Pacific Tech and its employees to face the consequences of their crimes. "They're planning to run," Daniel told Victoria during one of their evening meetings. "Morrison has been transferring money to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Kim has purchased property in Malaysia, and Bradley has been making inquiries about residency in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States." Victoria stared at the evidence Daniel had compiled, her expression hardening with each revelation. "How much time do we have?" "Based on their financial preparations, I'd estimate they'll be ready to disappear within 6 to 8 weeks. Once they leave the country, recovering the stolen money becomes nearly impossible." Victoria stood and paced to the window, looking out at the city lights as if searching for answers in their patterns. When she turned back to Daniel, her face carried the resolve of someone who had run out of patience with half measures. "Then we don't wait for prosecutors or regulatory agencies," she said firmly. "We expose everything next week and let the consequences fall where they may." Daniel felt a surge of admiration for Victoria's courage, mixed with anticipation for the battle ahead. "Are you ready for war, Victoria? Because once we light this fuse, it's going to explode everything these men have built." Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "Mr. Reyes, I've been ready for war since the day I discovered they were stealing from people who trusted them. Let's show these thieves what happens when they threaten the wrong family." The plan to expose the conspiracy began to unravel on a Tuesday morning when Daniel arrived at Martinez Auto Repair to find 2 federal agents waiting for him in the parking lot. They introduced themselves as Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and Agent Michael Rodriguez from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they wanted to discuss Daniel's recent consulting work with Pacific Tech Industries. Daniel's first instinct was relief. Perhaps Victoria had contacted federal authorities without telling him, accelerating their timeline for bringing the corrupt executives to justice. But as he sat in the agent's rental car, listening to their questions, Daniel realized that something was very wrong with their investigation. "Mr. Reyes," Agent Chen said, her tone professionally neutral, "we understand you've been providing translation services for Pacific Tech's CEO, Victoria Sterling. Can you tell us about the nature of that work?" Daniel chose his words carefully. "Ms. Sterling asked me to help her understand some Chinese business documents. Why do you ask?" Agent Rodriguez leaned forward from the back seat. "We're investigating allegations that Ms. Sterling has been using Pacific Tech's Chinese operations to hide assets from American tax authorities. Your linguistic expertise appears to be central to that scheme." Daniel felt the world shift beneath him. "I'm sorry, what? You think Victoria is hiding assets?" Agent Chen studied Daniel's face carefully. "Mr. Reyes, are you aware that Victoria Sterling has been transferring large amounts of money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands over the past 18 months? "That's impossible," Daniel said immediately. "She's been investigating executives who were doing exactly that kind of thing." The agents exchanged a look that suggested Daniel had just confirmed something they suspected. Agent Rodriguez opened a file folder and withdrew a series of financial documents. "These are bank records from Sterling's personal accounts," Rodriguez said, sliding the papers across to Daniel. Over the past year and a half, she has transferred nearly $4 million to shell companies in offshore tax havens. The transfers coincide exactly with discrepancies we've identified in Pacific Tech's financial reports. Daniel stared at the documents, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The account numbers, transaction dates, and transfer amounts painted a clear picture of systematic financial misconduct, but it was Victoria's name on every document, Victoria's signature, authorizing every suspicious transaction. This doesn't make sense, Daniel said, though even as he spoke, he could feel doubt beginning to creep into his certainty. Victoria is the one who discovered the fraud. She's been working to expose it. Agent Chen's expression softened slightly. Mr. Reyes, I think you need to consider the possibility that Ms. Sterling has been manipulating you. Think about how she approached you, how she convinced you to help her investigate her own executives. Did it ever occur to you that she might be using your expertise to cover up her own crimes? Daniel's mind raced back through his interactions with Victoria, searching for signs that he had been deceived. Her knowledge of the company's financial irregularities, her access to confidential documents, her willingness to work late hours investigating the conspiracy, all of it could be explained by guilt rather than innocence. She showed me evidence, Daniel said weakly, documents proving that her executives were stealing money. Agent Rodriguez nodded. Documents that she provided to you? Documents that she could have created or modified to support whatever story she wanted you to believe. Mr. Reyes, you're an expert in international financial fraud. Surely you understand how easy it would be for someone with CEO-level access to create false evidence. Daniel felt sick. If the agents were correct, if Victoria had been manipulating him from the beginning, then everything he thought he knew about the conspiracy was wrong. The executives he had been investigating might be innocent, and the woman he had trusted was the real thief. But there was something that didn't fit with the agent's theory. If Victoria is the criminal, Daniel asked, why would she hire a forensic accountant to investigate her own company? Why would she risk exposure? Agent Chen smiled grimly. Because hiring an investigator and claiming to cooperate with authorities is the best way to deflect suspicion. It's a classic technique. Investigate yourself so thoroughly that no one else bothers to look closely. The agents gave Daniel their contact information and instructed him to call immediately if Victoria attempted to involve him in any additional financial activities. They also warned him that, as a potential witness in a federal investigation, he could face criminal charges if he helped conceal evidence or obstruct justice. After the agents left, Daniel sat in his car for nearly an hour, trying to reconcile what he had just learned with everything he thought he knew about Victoria Sterling. The evidence they had shown him was compelling, but it contradicted his every instinct about Victoria's character and motivations. There was only one way to resolve his doubts. He needed to confront Victoria directly and give her a chance to explain the financial records that seemed to implicate her. Daniel called Victoria's private number and arranged to meet her that evening at their usual cafe. But this time, he arrived early and positioned himself where he could observe her arrival, watching for any signs of the deception the federal agents had described. Victoria arrived exactly on time, looking tired and stressed in a way that seemed genuine rather than performed. She ordered her usual coffee and sat across from Daniel with the weary expression of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "Daniel, I'm glad you called," she began. "I've been reviewing our timeline for exposing the conspiracy, and I think we need to move even faster. I've discovered evidence that Morrison and his associates are planning to transfer additional money out of the country this week." Daniel studied Victoria's face, searching for signs of deception. "Victoria, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly." Something in his tone made Victoria pause, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What's wrong?" Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew copies of the financial records Agent Chen had shown him. He placed them on the table between them, watching Victoria's reaction carefully. Federal agents came to see me today, Daniel said quietly. They showed me these documents and told me that you've been transferring millions of dollars to offshore accounts. They think you're the one who's been stealing from Pacific Tech. Victoria's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went white, her hands began to tremble, and she looked like she might be sick. But rather than the defensive anger Daniel might have expected from someone who had been falsely accused, Victoria's response was something he hadn't anticipated. She looked relieved. "Thank God," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was beginning to think they would never figure it out." Daniel felt his world shift again, this time in a completely different direction. "Victoria, what are you talking about?" Victoria looked around the cafe nervously, then leaned across the table toward Daniel. "Those financial records are real," she said quietly. "I've been transferring money to offshore accounts, but not to steal it, to hide it from the executives who were trying to steal it." Daniel stared at her, struggling to understand. "What do you mean?" "Daniel, the conspiracy is even bigger than we thought. Morrison, Kim, and Bradley weren't just stealing pension funds. They were planning to bankrupt the entire company and disappear with every asset Pacific Tech had accumulated over 20 years. Victoria's voice became urgent, almost desperate. 6 months ago, I discovered that they had been systematically looting company accounts, falsifying financial reports to hide the theft, and preparing to blame the company's collapse on external factors. They were going to steal everything and leave 800 employees with nothing, no jobs, no pensions, no severance, nothing. Daniel felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So you started moving company money to accounts they couldn't access?" Victoria nodded. "Every dollar I transferred to those offshore accounts is company money that I saved from being stolen. I've been documenting every transaction, maintaining complete records, and preparing to return every penny once the conspiracy is exposed and the real thieves are arrested." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small key. "This opens a safety deposit box that contains complete documentation of every transfer I've made, along with the access codes needed to retrieve the money. I was planning to give it to federal investigators once we had enough evidence to prove Morrison's guilt." Daniel took the key, feeling its weight as both a physical object and a symbol of trust. "Victoria, why didn't you tell me about this from the beginning?" "Because I needed you to investigate the conspiracy without any preconceptions about what you might find. If I had told you that I was secretly moving company money, would you have been able to give me objective analysis of the financial evidence?" Daniel considered her question and realized she was probably right. If he had known Victoria was conducting her own financial operations, he might have been less thorough in his investigation of the other executives. "Besides," Victoria continued, "I wasn't sure I could trust you completely at first. For all I knew, you could have been working for Morrison or one of the others, sent to infiltrate my investigation and report back to them." Daniel laughed, despite the seriousness of their situation. "You thought I was a corporate spy. Daniel, you appeared in my boardroom with exactly the skills I needed to investigate international financial fraud, at exactly the moment when I was struggling to understand Chinese business documents. That was either an incredible coincidence or a very sophisticated setup." Victoria's explanation made sense, but it also raised new questions about their situation. "If you've been hiding company money from the thieves and federal agents know about your transfers, then we're running out of time. Those executives are going to realize that their accounts are being monitored, and they'll accelerate their plans to disappear." Victoria nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to expose everything immediately. Not next week, not next month. Tonight." Daniel felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with high-stakes decision-making. "What do you have in mind?" Victoria's smile was sharp and determined. "I have in mind the kind of public exposure that makes it impossible for criminals to hide, impossible for prosecutors to ignore, and impossible for stolen money to stay stolen." She leaned forward, her grey eyes bright with the intensity of someone who had been planning for this moment for months. Daniel, how do you feel about becoming the most important whistleblower in corporate America? Victoria's plan was audacious, dangerous, and completely dependent on timing that would have to be perfect down to the minute. She wanted to expose the conspiracy during Pacific Tech's quarterly board meeting, which was scheduled for the following Thursday, just 6 days away. The board meeting would include not only Pacific Tech's directors and senior executives, but also representatives from major investors, regulatory compliance officers, and members of the financial press. It's the only setting where we can present our evidence to everyone who matters simultaneously, Victoria explained, as they sat in her car outside the cafe, away from potential surveillance. If we do this privately, Morrison and his conspirators will have time to destroy evidence, transfer assets, and create alternative narratives. But if we expose them publicly, in front of witnesses they can't control or intimidate, they'll be trapped. Daniel understood the logic, but he also understood the risks. Victoria, if we're wrong about anything, if there are elements of this conspiracy we haven't uncovered, if Morrison has contingency plans we don't know about, we'll be walking into an ambush. Victoria's expression was grim but determined. Daniel, I've been thinking about this for months. Morrison and his associates believe they're untouchable because they control the information flow within the company. They've been careful to keep their criminal activities compartmentalized so that no single person except them understands the full scope of what they've stolen. She pulled out a tablet and showed Daniel a detailed timeline she had been developing. But their compartmentalization is also their weakness. They don't know that I've been investigating them. They don't know that you've been helping me trace their financial activities. And they don't know that federal agents have already identified suspicious patterns in the company's accounts. Daniel studied Victoria's timeline, noting the careful coordination she had planned between their presentation of evidence and the arrival of federal investigators. You've already contacted the FBI. Not directly, but I've been feeding information to a financial journalist named Sarah Mitchell, who specializes in corporate fraud. She's been building her own investigation based on the evidence I've provided, and she's been sharing her findings with federal authorities. Victoria smiled with satisfaction. What Morrison doesn't know is that Sarah will be at the board meeting as an accredited member of the financial press, and she'll be prepared to publish a comprehensive exposé of the conspiracy within hours of our presentation. The next 6 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt like planning for the most important battle of Daniel's life. During the day, he continued working at Martinez Auto Repair, maintaining the fiction of normalcy while his mind raced through scenarios, contingencies, and the 1,000 details that would determine whether their plan succeeded or destroyed them both. In the evenings, Daniel and Victoria met in different locations each night, reviewing evidence, refining their presentation, and preparing for every question or challenge they might face. Victoria had compiled a comprehensive dossier of financial records, email communications, and documented transfers that painted an undeniable picture of systematic theft. But Daniel's most important contribution was his analysis of the international components of the conspiracy, the Chinese shell companies, the fraudulent contracts, and the sophisticated money laundering scheme that had allowed Morrison and his associates to hide their crimes for so long. This isn't just embezzlement, Daniel explained as they reviewed the evidence for the final time. This is a multinational criminal enterprise that has been using Pacific Tech as a front for money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud across multiple jurisdictions. The amounts we're talking about, over $20 million, represent systematic theft that could have destroyed hundreds of families. Victoria nodded, her jaw set with determination. Which is exactly why we can't let them escape with it. On Wednesday evening, the night before the board meeting, Daniel called Sophia in Los Angeles. Her voice was bright with excitement about her college preparation classes with Carmen, but Daniel could hear the underlying concern she carried for his well-being. "Papa, are you okay? You sound tired." Daniel looked around the small apartment that had been his refuge for so many years, knowing that after tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same. "I'm fine, Misha. Just working on something important that should be finished tomorrow." "The thing that Mama wrote about in her letter?" "Yes, the thing she wrote about." Sophia was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could picture her processing the implications with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to her studies. "Papa, I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you, and I know Mama would be proud too." Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes. "I love you, Sophia, more than anything in the world. I love you too, Papa. Be careful tomorrow, okay?" After ending the call, Daniel sat in the quiet apartment, surrounded by the evidence of their investigation and the weight of what tomorrow would bring. He pulled out Maria's photograph and spoke to her as if she were sitting beside him. "I hope I'm doing the right thing, mi amor. I hope I'm strong enough for what's coming." The morning of the board meeting, Daniel arrived at Pacific Tech Industries wearing his best suit, the same one he had worn to Maria's funeral, and carrying a briefcase that contained copies of every piece of evidence they had compiled. The building's lobby seemed different somehow, charged with the anticipation of confrontation. Victoria met him at the elevator, looking professional and composed, despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "Are you ready for this, Daniel?" "As ready as I can be. What about you?" Victoria's smile was sharp with determination. "I've been ready for this since the day I discovered they were stealing from people who trusted them." The elevator carried them to the 15th floor, where the boardroom Daniel had first entered by mistake was now prepared for the most important meeting in Pacific Tech's history. Representatives from major investors sat alongside board members, while financial journalists, including Sarah Mitchell, occupied seats at the back of the room. Richard Morrison, James Kim, and Thomas Bradley were already seated at the conference table, looking confident and relaxed. They nodded pleasantly to Victoria as she entered, clearly unaware that their carefully constructed criminal enterprise was about to collapse around them. "Before we begin with the standard quarterly reports," Victoria announced as she took her position at the head of the table, "I have some urgent financial irregularities to discuss that require the board's immediate attention." Morrison's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "Victoria, if this is about the minor discrepancies we discussed last month..." "Richard, I think you'll find that these are considerably more than minor discrepancies." Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone who held all the cards and was ready to play them. "Mr. Daniel Reyes, who many of you may remember from our previous meeting, has been conducting a comprehensive analysis of our international financial operations. His findings are quite illuminating." Daniel stood, feeling the weight of every person's attention in the room. The moment had arrived when his expertise, his integrity, and his courage would be tested before the most important audience of his life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Over the past month, I have uncovered evidence of systematic embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud within Pacific Tech Industries that has resulted in the theft of over $20 million in company and employee assets." The room erupted in shocked murmurs, but Morrison's reaction was the most telling. The color drained from his face, and his hands began to tremble as he realized that his carefully hidden crimes were about to be exposed to everyone who mattered. Daniel opened his briefcase and began distributing copies of the financial evidence to board members, investors, and journalists. "What you're seeing is documented proof that 3 senior executives have been using Pacific Tech's legitimate business operations to hide a criminal conspiracy that spans multiple countries and involves dozens of fraudulent transactions." As Daniel continued his presentation, methodically walking through each piece of evidence and explaining its significance, he could see the faces around the table transforming from confusion to understanding to outrage. The investors looked furious, the board members appeared stunned, and the journalists were taking notes with the focused intensity of people who recognized a major story. But it was the expressions on Morrison, Kim, and Bradley's faces that told Daniel everything he needed to know about the accuracy of their investigation. These weren't the faces of innocent men being falsely accused. These were the faces of criminals who had been caught and knew their time was running out. Victoria stood as Daniel concluded his presentation. Based on Mr. Reyes's findings and in consultation with federal authorities who have been conducting their own parallel investigation, I am recommending that the board immediately suspend these three executives pending criminal prosecution, freeze all company accounts they have access to, and begin proceedings to recover the stolen assets. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah Mitchell's fingers flying across her laptop keyboard as she prepared to publish the story that would make Pacific Tech's corruption scandal front-page news across the country. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Victoria, you don't understand what you're doing. If this becomes public, it will destroy the company. Everyone will lose their jobs." Victoria's smile was cold as winter steel. "Richard, the company was already being destroyed by you and your associates. The only difference is that now the people you were stealing from will have a chance to get their money back." Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched the corrupt executives realize that their carefully planned escape routes had been cut off, their hidden assets had been traced, and their victims were about to receive justice. But he also felt a deeper sense of completion, as if he had finally honored the promise he had made to Maria and the faith Sophia had placed in him. The battle was about to be won, but the war for justice was just beginning. Morrison's attempt to regain control of the situation came swift and desperate. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor, and faced the assembled board members with the kind of corporate authority he had wielded for years. "This is outrageous," Morrison declared, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating opposition. "Victoria has clearly been manipulated by this mechanic, who has no business involving himself in complex corporate financial matters he couldn't possibly understand." Daniel felt the familiar sting of class-based dismissal, but this time it only strengthened his resolve. He had anticipated this line of attack and prepared for it carefully. "Mr. Morrison," Daniel replied calmly, "perhaps you'd like to explain why your personal bank accounts show deposits totaling $3.2 million over the past 18 months, when your official Pacific Tech salary is $180,000 per year." Morrison's confident facade cracked slightly. "Those deposits represent legitimate consulting income from shell companies that exist only on paper and have no business operations beyond transferring stolen money." Daniel interrupted, consulting his handwritten notes. "Companies like Cascade International Solutions, which lists its business address as a mail forwarding service in Delaware, and Pacific Rim Consulting, which hasn't filed tax returns in any jurisdiction where it claims to operate." The board members were following the exchange with growing alarm, clearly beginning to understand the scope of what had been happening within their company. Margaret Wong, the board's longest-serving independent director, leaned forward with obvious concern. "Richard, these are very serious accusations. Do you have documentation to support your claims about legitimate consulting income?" Morrison glanced nervously at Kim and Bradley, both of whom looked like they were struggling not to panic. "Margaret, this is obviously some kind of coordinated attack on the company's leadership. Victoria has been acting erratically for months, and now she's brought in this outside agitator to gruel—" "Mr. Morrison," interrupted Sarah Mitchell, the financial journalist, her voice cutting through his deflection with surgical precision. "I've been investigating Pacific Tech's financial practices for the past 2 months, based on evidence provided by a confidential source. Would you care to comment on the $4.7 million in unauthorized transfers from employee pension accounts to accounts controlled by you, Mr. Kim, and Mr. Bradley?" The room fell silent, except for the soft clicking of computer keyboards, as other journalists began updating their stories in real time. Morrison's face had gone pale, and Daniel could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. James Kim, who had remained silent until now, suddenly stood and moved toward the exit. I don't have to listen to this. These accusations are completely baseless, and I'm calling my attorney. Mr. Kim. Victoria's voice stopped him before he reached the door. I should mention that federal agents are stationed in the building's lobby, and they have warrants for the arrest of anyone who attempts to leave this meeting before it concludes. Kim froze, his hand on the door handle, as the full reality of their situation became clear. There would be no escape, no last-minute flight to countries without extradition treaties, no opportunity to destroy evidence or transfer additional assets to hidden accounts. Thomas Bradley, the human resources executive who had been systematically stealing from employee benefit funds, finally broke under the pressure. "This is insane," he burst out, his voice cracking with stress. "Victoria, you can't possibly think you can destroy 3 careers based on the word of some grease monkey who doesn't understand corporate finance." Daniel felt a surge of anger at Bradley's contempt, but he channeled it into cold, methodical precision. "Mr. Bradley, let's discuss your understanding of corporate finance. Specifically, let's discuss the 147 unauthorized reductions in employee benefit contributions that you processed over the past 2 years, totaling $1.8 million in stolen money." Daniel opened a folder and withdrew a stack of documents. These are payroll records showing the difference between what employees were told they were contributing to their retirement accounts and what was actually deposited. The missing money was transferred to accounts controlled by your consulting company, Employee Solutions International. He handed copies of the payroll records to board members, watching their faces as they processed the systematic nature of the theft. "Mr. Bradley, would you like to explain to Elena Vasquez, who has worked in customer service for 12 years, why her retirement account is missing 23,000 in contributions she believes were deposited?" Bradley's face crumpled as he realized that Daniel had documented every aspect of his crimes in excruciating detail. "You don't understand," he said weakly. "The company was facing financial pressures. We were trying to preserve everyone's jobs." "By stealing their retirement money?" Victoria's voice carried the cold fury of someone who had been betrayed by people she had trusted. "Tom, you weren't preserving jobs, you were financing luxury cars, vacation homes, and offshore investment accounts, while telling honest workers that their futures were secure." Margaret Wong had been studying the financial documents Daniel had provided, and her expression had shifted from concern to outrage. "Richard, I want a direct answer. Did you or did you not authorize the transfer of company funds to personal accounts?" Morrison looked around the boardroom like a trapped animal, searching for any escape from the evidence that surrounded him. His eyes settled on Daniel with undisguised hatred. "This man," Morrison said, pointing at Daniel with a trembling finger, "has no authority to investigate this company's finances. He's a mechanic who was hired to do manual labor, and Victoria has manipulated him into believing he's some kind of corporate detective." Daniel stood slowly, feeling the weight of every person's attention in the room. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment when his working-class background would either be used to discredit him or would become the source of his moral authority. "Mr. Morrison, you're absolutely right about one thing," Daniel said quietly. "I am a mechanic. I work with my hands. I earn an honest living, and I understand what it means to worry about paying bills and saving for my family's future." Daniel's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But what you don't understand is that being a mechanic doesn't make me stupid, and it doesn't make me dishonest. I spent 15 years in international logistics before I became a mechanic, and I understand corporate finance better than you apparently do." He gestured toward the evidence spread across the conference table. "Because unlike you, I know the difference between legitimate business expenses and systematic theft. Unlike you, I understand that employee benefit contributions aren't corporate slush funds to be raided when executives want to increase their personal wealth." Daniel paused, looking directly at Morrison with steady determination. And unlike you, I believe that people who work hard and trust their employers deserve to have that trust honored, not betrayed by criminals who think their corporate titles make them untouchable. The boardroom was completely silent as Daniel's words settled over the assembled executives, investors, and journalists. Margaret Wong was nodding slowly, clearly impressed by Daniel's moral clarity and professional expertise. "Mr. Reyes," she said finally, "based on the evidence you've presented and the responses we've heard from our executives, I believe the board needs to take immediate action to protect the company and its employees." She turned to address Morrison, Kim, and Bradley directly. "Gentlemen, you are hereby suspended from all duties pending investigation of these allegations. Security will escort you from the building, and you are prohibited from accessing company accounts, communications, or facilities." As if summoned by her words, the boardroom doors opened to admit federal agents who had been waiting in the corridor. Agent Sarah Chen, whom Daniel recognized from their conversation in the auto repair parking lot, stepped forward with arrest warrants. "Richard Morrison, James Kim, and Thomas Bradley," Agent Chen announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement of employee benefit funds, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." As the federal agents read the Miranda rights to the three corrupt executives, Daniel felt a profound sense of completion washing over him. The fight that had begun with his accidental entry into this boardroom weeks ago was finally reaching its conclusion, and justice was being served for the workers whose trust had been betrayed. The arrests of Morrison, Kim, and Bradley created a controlled chaos in the boardroom as federal agents processed the three executives while board members, investors, and journalists watched in stunned silence. Daniel remained standing beside Victoria, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion as the culmination of weeks of investigation played out before them. But the drama was far from over. As Agent Chen finished reading Morrison his rights, the disgraced CFO turned to face Daniel with a look of pure malice. "You think you've won something here," Morrison said, his voice carrying the venom of a man who had lost everything. "You have no idea what you've destroyed. This company will collapse now, and 800 people will lose their jobs because of your self-righteous crusade." Daniel felt the weight of Morrison's accusation, recognizing the grain of truth within the threat. Exposing the conspiracy would indeed create significant challenges for Pacific Tech Industries, and some employees might suffer short-term consequences as the company worked to recover from the scandal. But before Daniel could respond, Margaret Wong stood and addressed Morrison directly. "Richard, this company was already being destroyed by you and your criminal associates. The only difference is that now we have a chance to save it." She turned to address the entire room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in corporate leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen, while today's revelations are shocking and deeply troubling, they also represent an opportunity for Pacific Tech Industries to rebuild itself on a foundation of integrity and transparency." Margaret's words seemed to steady the room, providing a sense of direction in the midst of the chaos. "Mr. Reyes, Ms. Sterling, your investigation has exposed crimes that threatened the livelihoods and futures of hundreds of employees. The board will ensure that your efforts are recognized and rewarded." Victoria stepped forward, her expression reflecting both exhaustion and determination. "Margaret, our immediate priority must be recovering the stolen assets and restoring them to the employee accounts where they belong. Mr. Reyes has identified most of the financial trails, and I've been working with federal authorities to freeze the relevant accounts." Agent Chen nodded confirmation. "Ms. Sterling is correct. Based on the evidence provided by Mr. Reyes and Ms. Sterling, we've obtained court orders to freeze over $30 million in assets connected to this conspiracy. The recovery process will take time, but we expect to restore the vast majority of stolen funds to their rightful owners." Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction at the news, knowing that Elena Vasquez would get back her missing retirement contributions, that Robert Chen would have the medical coverage he had been counting on, and that hundreds of other workers would have their trust in the system restored. Sarah Mitchell, the financial journalist, raised her hand to ask a question. "Mr. Reyes, what motivated you to get involved in this investigation? You weren't an employee of Pacific Tech Industries, and you had no obvious personal stake in exposing this conspiracy." Daniel considered the question carefully, thinking about Sophia, about Maria, about the promise he had made to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. "Ms. Mitchell, I have a daughter who's brilliant and hard-working, and she deserves to live in a world where honesty and integrity are rewarded, not punished. When I learned that executives were stealing from workers, people like me, I couldn't stand by and do nothing." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who would be responsible for Pacific Tech's future. "My wife used to say that privilege comes with responsibility. These executives had the privilege of managing other people's money and other people's trust. They chose to betray that responsibility for personal gain." Sarah Mitchell was taking notes rapidly. "Will you be staying with Pacific Tech Industries to help with the recovery process?" Daniel glanced at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll help in whatever way I can, for as long as I'm needed. But my real job is being Sophia's father and making sure she has the opportunities she's earned through her own hard work." Margaret Wong smiled at Daniel's response. "Mr. Reyes, I think I speak for the entire board when I say that Pacific Tech Industries would be honored to have you join our team in whatever capacity you feel comfortable with. Your expertise and your integrity are exactly what this company needs as we rebuild." The formal part of the meeting concluded with the board voting unanimously to accept the resignations of the 3 arrested executives, to implement new financial oversight procedures, and to retain Daniel as a consultant for the asset recovery process. But as the various participants began to file out of the boardroom, Agent Chen approached Daniel with a serious expression. "Mr. Reyes, there's something else you need to know," Agent Chen said quietly. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence that Morrison and his associates were planning to eliminate you as a potential witness. We found communications discussing permanent solutions to the problem you represented." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, thinking about Sophia safely staying with Carmen in Los Angeles. "Are you saying they were planning to kill me?" "We're saying they were planning to hurt you and your daughter badly enough to ensure your silence," Agent Chen replied. "Your decision to move your daughter out of town probably saved both of your lives." Victoria, who had overheard the conversation, moved closer to Daniel with concern written across her face. "Daniel, I'm so sorry. I never intended to put you in physical danger." Daniel shook his head. "Victoria, you didn't put me in danger, they did, the moment they decided to steal from people who trusted them. And now they'll face the consequences for all of their crimes." As the boardroom emptied, Daniel and Victoria found themselves alone, except for the scattered papers and evidence that had brought down a criminal conspiracy worth tens of millions of dollars. The marble surfaces and expensive artwork looked the same as they had weeks ago, but everything else had changed completely. "So what happens now?" Victoria asked, settling into one of the leather chairs with obvious exhaustion. Daniel looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below, thinking about the workers who would soon learn that their stolen retirement funds were being recovered, about the justice that had been served, and about the future that was now possible for his daughter. "Now we go back to work," Daniel said simply. "You rebuild this company into something employees can be proud of, and I go back to being a mechanic who knows he did the right thing when it mattered." Victoria smiled for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "Daniel, I don't think you'll be just a mechanic much longer. I have a feeling your life is about to change in ways you haven't even imagined yet." As Daniel gathered his papers and prepared to leave the boardroom where his accidental arrival had started this entire journey, He felt Maria's presence with him more strongly than at any time since her death. He had kept the promise he made to her, had used his skills to help people who needed protection, and had shown Sophia that courage and integrity could triumph over power and corruption. The blue silk tie, Maria's gift of love and faith, had indeed brought him exactly where he needed to be, at exactly the moment when his expertise, his values, and his determination could make the greatest difference in the lives of people who deserved justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Pacific Tech Industries worked to recover from the scandal and rebuild its reputation. But tonight, Daniel Reyes could drive home knowing that 800 workers would sleep more soundly because of his courage to speak truth to power. 6 months after the Pacific Tech Industries scandal made national headlines, Daniel Reyes stood in his daughter's bedroom, watching her pack for her freshman year at UC Berkeley. The room looked much the same as it had before the investigation that changed their lives. The same textbooks stacked neatly on her desk, the same photographs of her mother on the nightstand, the same quiet determination that had always defined Sophia's approach to her future. But everything else had changed in ways that still surprised Daniel on a daily basis. The financial settlement from Pacific Tech Industries had not only covered Sophia's college expenses, but had provided enough security to ensure that Daniel would never again have to choose between his daughter's dreams and their family's immediate needs. More importantly, the recovered pension funds had been restored to the 800 employees who had unknowingly been robbed, giving families like Elena Vasquez and Robert Chen the retirement security they had earned through decades of honest work. Sophia held up 2 sweaters, considering which one to pack. "Papa, you know I'm proud of what you did, right? Not just the money, though the scholarship letter from the Workers' Rights Foundation was pretty amazing, but the fact that you stood up for people who needed someone to fight for them." Daniel smiled, remembering the day the scholarship letter had arrived. The Workers' Rights Foundation had created a full scholarship program for the children of employees whose pension funds had been recovered through Daniel's investigation, and Sophia had been selected as the program's first recipient. The letter had been signed by Elena Vasquez herself, who now served on the foundation's board of directors. "I'm proud of you too, Mija," Daniel replied, "for supporting me when it was scary, for understanding why I had to get involved, and for growing into the kind of person your mother hoped you would become." Sophia folded the sweaters carefully and placed them in her suitcase. "Mama knew this would happen, didn't she? She knew you'd get a chance to use your skills again and help people." Daniel thought about Maria's letter, which Sophia still carried with her everywhere, and about the wisdom that had guided them through the most challenging period of their lives. "Your mother understood me better than I understood myself. She knew that I couldn't stay hidden forever, that eventually I would need to step back into the world where I could make a difference." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Daniel recognized Victoria Sterling's number and answered with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the months of working together to rebuild Pacific Tech Industries. "Daniel, are you busy?" Victoria's voice carried excitement that immediately got his attention. "Just helping Sophia pack for college. What's happening?" "I just got off the phone with the Justice Department. Morrison, Kim, and Bradley all pled guilty this morning. Morrison gets 12 years in federal prison, Kim gets 10 years, and Bradley gets 8 years. More importantly, the asset forfeiture agreement means we'll recover an additional $4 million in hidden accounts." Daniel felt a deep satisfaction at the news. Justice had been served, and more money would be returned to the people who had been robbed. "That's excellent news, Victoria. How are you feeling about it?" "Relieved, mostly, and grateful that you were willing to see this through to the end." Victoria paused. "Daniel, there's something else. The board met yesterday, and we'd like to offer you a permanent position as our Director of Financial Integrity. It would mean overseeing all of our international operations, ensuring that what happened with Morrison never happens again." Daniel looked at Sophia, who had stopped packing and was listening to his side of the conversation with obvious interest. The offer was tempting. It would mean returning full-time to the professional world he had left behind, using his expertise in a way that could prevent other companies from betraying their employees' trust. "It's a generous offer, Victoria. Can I think about it?" "Of course. But Daniel, I want you to know that this isn't charity or gratitude. Pacific Tech needs someone with your skills and your integrity. The business world needs more people who understand that corporations have responsibilities to their employees, not just their shareholders." After ending the call, Daniel sat on Sophia's bed and looked around the room that had been her sanctuary throughout her childhood. Soon she would be gone, starting her own adult life, and he would have to decide what the next chapter of his own life should look like. "You should take the job, Papa," Sophia said quietly, resuming her packing with the careful efficiency she had inherited from her mother. "How can you be so sure?" Sophia smiled, and Daniel saw Maria's wisdom reflected in her expression. "Because you've spent 8 years taking care of me, making sure I had everything I needed to succeed. Now it's time for you to take care of yourself, to do work that makes you feel proud and useful again." She pulled Maria's letter from her purse and handed it to Daniel. "Besides, Mama wrote something else in here that I think you need to read again." Daniel unfolded the letter and found the passage Sophia was referring to, written in Maria's careful handwriting. "When Sophia is grown and ready to make her own way in the world, I hope you will remember that your life still has purpose beyond being her father. The world needs your talents, your integrity, and your compassion. Don't hide from that calling because you think you're too old or too far removed from the professional world. The best leaders are those who understand what it means to struggle, to sacrifice, and to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes as he read his wife's words, written years ago, but speaking directly to his current situation. Maria had anticipated this moment, when he would have to choose between the safety of the life he had built and the challenge of stepping back into a world where he could make a broader difference. "She knew," Daniel whispered. "She knew I would have this choice to make." Sophia came over and hugged him, her embrace carrying all the love and strength Maria had instilled in both of them. "She also knew you would make the right choice, just like you did when you decided to help Victoria expose those executives." Over the next week, as Daniel helped Sophia settle into her dormitory at UC Berkeley and watched her begin the college experience she had worked so hard to earn, he thought about Victoria's offer and about the future that lay ahead. The scared, desperate man who had walked into Pacific Tech Industries looking for a warehouse job seemed like a different person. Now, someone who had been hiding from his own capabilities and his own responsibility to use those capabilities for good. On the day he returned home from Berkeley, Daniel called Victoria and accepted the position as Director of Financial Integrity. The work would be challenging, requiring him to rebuild his professional skills and adapt to a business world that had changed significantly during his years as a mechanic. But it would also be meaningful, giving him the opportunity to protect other employees from the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed Pacific Tech. The blue silk tie that had carried him through the investigation now hung in his closet next to new suits, appropriate for his corporate position. But Daniel knew he would continue wearing it to important meetings and significant events, carrying Maria's love with him as he stepped into this new phase of his life. 3 months into his new position, Daniel received a letter that brought his journey full circle. It was from Elena Vasquez, the customer service representative, whose stolen retirement funds had been among the first Daniel had traced during the investigation. "Mr. Reyes," Elena had written in her careful English, "I wanted you to know that because of what you did, I will be able to retire next year with the dignity and security I worked for 30 years to earn. My granddaughter wants to study engineering, and now I can help her pay for college the way you helped your own daughter. Thank you for showing us that there are still people who will fight for what is right, even when it's dangerous and difficult." Daniel placed Elena's letter on his desk next to Sophia's college graduation photo and Maria's wedding picture, creating a small shrine to the values and people that had shaped his life. The man who had once hidden his talents beneath car hoods had become someone who used those talents to protect others, and the promise he had made to Maria about fighting for Sophia's future had evolved into a commitment to fight for the futures of all the families who depended on corporate integrity. As Daniel looked out the window of his new office at Pacific Tech Industries, he could see the parking lot where his Honda Civic sat beside the luxury cars of other executives. The contrast reminded him daily that his perspective as someone who had struggled, who had worried about paying bills and securing his family's future, was exactly what the corporate world needed more of. The warehouse job he had originally applied for had been filled by someone else, but Daniel often visited the warehouse floor to talk with employees, to listen to their concerns, and to ensure that the executives they trusted would never again betray that trust. He was no longer just investigating financial fraud, he was helping to create a corporate culture where such fraud became impossible. Sophia called every Sunday evening, sharing stories of her biochemistry studies, her new friendships, and her plans for the research career she was building toward. In every conversation, Daniel could hear the confidence and security that came from knowing her future was bright with possibility. "Papa," Sophia said during one of their calls, "my professors have been talking about internship opportunities at biotech companies for next summer. I think I want to work somewhere that's trying to develop more affordable medications for people who can't afford expensive treatments." Daniel smiled, recognizing in Sophia's career aspirations the same commitment to helping others that had guided his own recent decisions. "That sounds like something your mother would have loved to hear about. I think she would be proud of both of us," Sophia replied. "You for becoming the kind of leader who protects working families, and me for choosing to use my education to help people who need it most." As Daniel ended the call and prepared to leave his office for the evening, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from a desperate mechanic to a corporate executive with the power to protect others. The investigation that had begun with his accidental entry into a boardroom had evolved into a career that honored both Maria's memory and Sophia's future. The blue silk tie hung in his closet at home, waiting for the next important meeting, the next moment when he would need to carry Maria's love and faith with him as he fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. And Daniel Reyes, former mechanic, loving father, and reluctant hero, was ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead.